Hello, everyone. I am Devin Moore, Humanity Rising Ambassador, founder of Race to Speak Up, an anti-bullying organization, and your host of Humanity Rising's Mindful Connections podcast. We've partnered with Open Mind Health to bring you mental health professionals from across the country to educate and give you advice in real time on subjects like today's topic, which is LGBTQ plus mental health. If you have any questions during the episode, please feel free to just put them in the chat and our guests will answer. Joining us today is Kelly Smith. Kelly is a clinical manager at Open Minds Health. Kelly has vast experience with the LGBTQIA2S plus community, both in a personal lived experience and as a provider of talk therapy to the community. Kelly is also well versed in trauma informed care and has worked in a variety of venues, including foster care, community mental health, addictions, and school systems, as well as private practice and online telehealth agencies. Hi, Kelly. How are you today?
I'm good, Devin. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be here.
Yeah, so can you tell us what first drew you into the mental health field?
Well, it feels like it's always been a part of my life. I think we informally sort of take those roles on in our younger years. I was always sort of that person that people went to, both family and friends. So it just kind of came naturally. So when I was, looking at colleges, when they introduced the concept of social work to me, it, really clicked at that point that, oh, that's what I've been doing informally for a long time. So it's just been my niche. It's always been, um, what I've wanted to do and what I know that I do best.
That's honestly very inspiring for me. I'm as someone who I know we was talking before, but as someone who's currently a psychology major and kind of looking on to the variety of different fields within mental health. So just want to say that's personally inspiring for me. But
Hmm.
so you've worked extensively in the foster care system, both professionally and personally as a foster parent. How has that dual perspective shaped the way you support LGBTQ plus youth in that system?
What's interesting, I worked many years in public mental health, and we worked side by side, sort of with the foster care system. They were another county agency. So the lens that you have in there is interesting because you see a lot of burnout with the employees, but also um, a lot of judgment around the people, the parents that are losing their children to the system, and then being a foster parent, it's an altogether different lens and becomes more personal in terms of my relationship with those workers at the Department of Social Services, and then just how that system truly works. Um, Not so favorably for the families and children, unfortunately. And for LGBTQ youth, they're 30% of youth in the system identify within our community, LGBTQ community, which is an overrepresentation in the system that's really not equipped to manage that because you already have a level of service to those youth in foster care in general that's not that great. But then when you're not really familiar with how to work with LGBTQ youth, I think there's uh, a higher chance that those youth will be subjected to more mental health issues because they won't be understood, the sense of loneliness, and discrimination even that they may face by the system and their foster parents.
I hear what you're saying. Honestly, though I did not grow up in the foster care system, I did grow up being queer and also black at that, being both queer and black, but a queer individual in American society. And I definitely understand the challenges, unfortunately, that arise from potential hate at school, hate through bullying, and also
Right.
just overall people not being able to understand you, and you also are on your own queer journey. So,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
And so one thing that kind of makes me, I wanted to, that kind of leads into the next question. So
Yeah.
I know you
No,
probably
that's fine.
add on to that, but it's kind of just alluding a little bit more. I kind of want you to expand more on some of the biggest mental health challenges faced by the LGBTQ plus youth in foster care. And like more so just how can we better support them?
Education. I think that there's really there's certain trainings that people have to take and to be a foster parent. I took that course. I don't see where there's any real curriculum that speaks to this to the queer community, where which is interesting when there's an overrepresentation of those youth in the system. So definitely education. You know, understanding how they're as a foster parent. Um, those youth going out to school and into the community in general, how they're met by the rest of society, and being sensitive to that and being able to figure out how to support them in the best way they can. So that's those are a couple of ways that they can work on it. The system can work on it by better educating the foster parents, and the foster parents can really do some personal work on how to support their children.
Yeah, something that actually reminds me of is just kind of this whole, I feel like this is something that needs to be talked about a bit more. What I'm about to bring up is the fact that not everything is reported. So the reason here, let me lead into that a bit more. So I took an international relations class, and essentially we had to talk about, we just got to choose our different topics. So I chose
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQ plus oh, it was LGBTQ plus rights globally. And so I
Okay.
was taking a look at a variety of different like countries, but I mainly was taking a look at America, and I saw kind of a bit of a common trend of literature stating that, there there are some reports of, or a certain amount of reports of maybe being kicked out of the house or police brutality simply for being queer, but not everything is reported. So those statistics could be even higher than they potentially already are, which is just by far concerning. And so when we spoke before the podcast, you actually mentioned that the bulk of your career has been in public mental health as well as substance abuse. Can you tell us more about that and explain how you might see those fields intersecting with LGBTQ plus identity?
When you think about the LGBTQ community, even if you look at it as an example, people between the ages of, let's say, 18 and 64, most of those 13%. So, according to AmericanProgress.org, in 2022, 13% of our community was uninsured. Um, Compared to 9% of the non-LGBTQ community. So what that's really meaning is your choices and your ability. So if that's what it is for adults, then it's probably, it's the ability to reach resources for the youth is even less, right? So what we would see is, uninsured, people who are unemployed, and those are the people that can access public mental health services, which is fine. I worked there for many years. We provided great service, but that's where it kind of intersects, because you can't go and get a private practitioner necessarily, and just do that. But that's where we're definitely generous in that, in those mental health settings. Um, but that's a big reason why, the lack of insurance and um, low income, unemployment, et cetera, and the discrimination. I think a lot of stigma around even finding treatment. So, which is probably something else we'll address in some of the other questions today. But um, that's kind of where it intersects, and we would see a lot of that because of it. And I worked in more rural settings as well, so that's a whole other demographic.
So as someone whose sweet spot is LGBTQ plus mental health, what are some unique therapeutic needs or considerations providers should be aware of when working with this community?
Don't assume there's supports, first of all. Oftentimes there are not. Um, I think understanding that loneliness may look different for the LGBTQ community than it does for somebody else, or the non-LGBTQ community. Um, Self-acceptance is more of a process. There's many more layers of that. I think as we're sort of coming to understand ourselves. We have to look at ourselves every day in the community that reflects it back to us, where non-LGBTQ folks do not have to deal with that every day. So we're always sort of processing, am I okay? Who am I? And that gets almost redefined uh, pretty frequently. We're always checking ourselves, I think, because it's put in our faces to do so. So taking that into consideration, and just understanding that there are more obstacles. There's just more obstacles, and as you layer other factors as well, that intersect, someone with a disability on top of it, or a person of color, like there's understanding that there's a lot of factors that go into what that person might need that's seeking out treatment, and how hard that is for them to seek it out and find somebody that they feel safe enough to talk to.
Something I'm hearing within what you're saying is we need to, one, provide the queer community with enough resources, especially young queer community, with
Yes.
resources to shine and feel comfortable. But another thing that I'm hearing is simply the fact that we need to use our thinking caps, our ears, and listen exactly to what queer people who are comfortable with being out and stuff are saying. So I
Right.
want to ask you, how how can one, this is a very big question, but how can one come out? Like, how does one go about that? If I can ask you that, if that's okay.
In what sense though? Like in
Oh,
general, or like,
I mean, more so kind of like I'm more so specifically talking in relation to family because there's families who we don't know are very accepting. My family was luckily very accepting. And then there's families on the other end where some of my friends are literally saying that they don't even talk to their parents anymore simply because the parents are just not for it. So how can someone deal with that? And simply, how can someone navigate knowing whether or not they even can come out, whether or not it's safe to within their family environment?
I think the first step would be really spending some time figuring out and making sure you kind of know, for the most part, who you are. Because I think when you have a sense that your family may not be accepting of you, then that's going to make you question yourself that much more, right? So if your family's saying, let me clip your wings, you're not this person, that you think you are, it's going to take us that much more to kind of get there. So, number one, having support, whether if you don't have friends and if you want a professional doing that, but and then sort of being in a position to then maybe then invite your parents or guardian in to that kind of a forum so that you can start a conversation about who you are and why that's okay. Because I think a lot of times these things come out in a not so great type of way because the person's really uh, concerned, fearful of the outcome, and it either somebody outs them or it's like haphazardly done sometimes, and because it's scary, and then the end result's not great. That feeling of fear gets reinforced. But I think if people do have the ability to do that in some sort of mediation, I'd encourage that. Not everybody has that, but if you do, I would encourage it that way. We do see that. We do see people calling, and there's a big differences in opinions, and so people have come to therapy to try to figure it out, which is good.
Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying. I think it's definitely, this just kind of reinforces the fact that we need more resources for queer community or just really just ensuring that it's available for all communities, what is in place, as well as furthering that education and furthering that knowledge. In fact, speaking about furthering knowledge, you just enrolled in a PhD program focused on
Yes, I
transgender health.
did.
Congratulations, guys. If you're listening to this, you better give like a little bit of a clap.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it took me about a decade and a half to decide. I think, when I look back to my process of doing that, universities try to stand out as their program as something different than what others offer, but I had never really found that special one until now. It's actually a program in clinical sexology, but with a I'm focusing on transgender care. And interestingly enough, the professor that I primarily take classes from, is basically an expert that in that field, and she talks a lot about just what you were saying, the desperate need for practitioners, providers that can sit with people and help them. Um, just using the person's name that is so validating to them. It's she said she has people come from all over the country, and so I think we need to do a better job. We need to have better understanding of people's needs, even within our community, understanding each other's process and respecting that. But then, as providers in the field, be trained, because she's also spoken to, and I know this is true. I've had this experience also. People think they are doing good by the client, and that they are knowledgeable and providing the treatment, but they're really not. And so in those cases, it ends up, being really challenging for that person to continue with treatment somewhere else. So, I know that our organization really tries hard to recruit providers that really, so when a person is looking for treatment, they can find pretty close to what they're looking for, because I think people won't go to treatment otherwise. Marginalized populations will not seek treatment if they don't feel it's safe enough.
Yeah, I'm very happy that Open Mind Health does that. It truly is so important. Just the simple fact that you're making me just think about all the emotions that I had growing up being queer, because it's definitely hard. That's what the main word
It
that
is
comes
hard.
to my
Yeah,
mind. Having to navigate, oh, okay, do I like boys? Do I like girls? Do I like both? What do I like? What do I feel like at my gender? What do I feel as far as my comfortability with my gender expression? There's so many components. And
there
then with
are.
the added layer of just kind of society not, um, wait, let me not say all society, but unfortunately, certain social norms being put in place that, for example, a man can't cry or a man can't be feminine or so then what about when it comes to not all queer men, but the queer men that are feminine? Society doesn't like to look fondly on that. Or just a variety. That's something that I've definitely, unfortunately, had to experience of just people saying such harsh words because I'm more comfortable within my own feminine energy.
Right.
So you also another thing that I actually remember you talking about a little bit when we were also speaking before is your want to influence policy. Can you share what kind of policies you'd like to see implemented to better support LGBTQ plus mental health on both the macro and micro levels?
I feel like, we had some policies starting to come into place. Those are pretty much rolled back now. But I think the biggest piece for me is education. I feel like no matter what we think we know, um, how much we think we've taught ourselves or read about, I think we need real information about people's needs. And I think that's sort of the foundation for providing the best care, right? And so in this case, for the LGBTQ community, um, we have to listen, we have to understand, we have to make space for, we have to then know what to provide. Like you can't provide something you haven't listened to and to understand the need. Um, and those things need to become policy. Those need to be in writing. Those need to be things that don't go away, because people need care. So whether it's mental health, physical health, a combination thereof, and to destigmatize groups, right? Like the way we um, stop, discriminating against each other, even, is to educate ourselves about who who we are and what we need. We're all pretty much the same. We need things, and we need people to recognize us. Everybody needs to be validated.
It just makes me think about how we really do need things like gender neutral bathrooms. We need to be respected when using they, them pronouns or any other gender variant related pronouns. I feel like society as a whole needs to understand that there is more than just heterosexuality, cisgendered heterosexuality. there's so many different types of things. LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, like
Right.
there's so
Well,
many.
and that these things do exist in some, in some spaces, and it's
Yeah.
okay then, but not in others. And so this is why policy is so necessary, and really education, because ignorance, when we lead with ignorance, it's usually not a friendly and happy space to be in.
With your background in trauma-informed care, how do you approach working with LGBTQ plus individuals who have experienced systemic or identity-based trauma?
I think relatability goes a long way here. I think when somebody can come into a space and understand that maybe you've experienced something similar, it helps to, number one, sort of be grounded in the process of seeking treatment to begin with, allows you to feel safe. I think, safety is the key for everything for human beings, right? If we don't feel safe, we can't really function properly. um, if you're, hungry or unhoused or, whatever you could think of that might make you feel unsafe. If you think about that, how well do you function under those circumstances? Not very well. So I think when somebody comes into this space, and they're so used to this systemic sort of discrimination, you're looking first for validation and proof somewhere that this isn't yet again another space where that's going to happen. Um, and I don't make assumptions, right, about what someone may have experienced, and how that landed for them. Even if I'm in the same community as them, it doesn't mean I know what they've experienced. And I feel like, that's very validating for people, very reassuring for people. So um, those things are pretty important.
I feel especially, and I know that there definitely are teachers or professors, educators that do go out of the way to ensure that their queer students or queer members of whatever workshop they may be in, feel validated and feel comfortable. But what would you say to those who aren't, and I'm particularly looking at not all of the older generation, but particularly the older generation that is what society would kind of say is stuck in their ways, not really able to, understand what's going on in modern society with what they would say as the days and the thems. Like, how do you go about even making this something for them to understand and acknowledge and respect and then ensure, actually just yeah, ensure respect. How do you go about that?
How do I get the older generation to ensure respect?
Yes, I'm asking that because typically one thing that Gen Z does is we are really not afraid to kind of speak out, but I want to make sure we
Yes.
speak out in a respectful way, also a way that actually will be understood. So how exactly can we even go about doing that that you suggest?
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. Well, I think so. I'm a Gen Xer, so and my son's a Gen Z, so it's an experiment at home all the time. But I think I think we have to, as the older generation, really have an open ear. So I think in particular, Gen Xers, there's kind of a split. Those closer to Boomers, which are harder to reach, because you have more of a more even more traditional line there, but not unreachable. I think again, it's educating. How does this affect you? That in a way in which your life is disrupted, and really, having really pointed questions, I think, is important. I think the older generation can wrap their mind around that. I think it's more nebulous things that they have a harder time with and be like, I don't really know what that means. I don't get these new fandango terms, and things like that. But I think if you ask them pointed questions, how does this affect your life? How is this disruptive to your life? What if I did that to you? Or what if I asked you that? Or what if I called you out by a different name, or used a different pronoun? I think the older generations can definitely understand that and would prefer that. Again, it's education, that's discussion. You can't reach everybody, we know that, but I think there are people that do want to learn. So it's just trying to have a conversation with them and being very open about it. But I don't see where Gen Zs have a problem really speaking their mind either. So, which is good.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's good that a lot of us Gen Z people really like to speak up. I'm all about speaking up. I'm the founder of Race to Speak Up. It's literally in the name. I want
Right,
to speak up when they're going through bullying. I advocate for, creating a safer and more inclusive environment, especially in months like these. Although I mean to do this all around, but especially at times like these, where, especially in modern day, where certain potential policy, not potential, certain policies are currently trying to be enforced that are specifically against trans community or
right,
specifically other varieties of the queer community. It's kind of times like these where we need to ensure that our queer family members, our queer students, our queer parents, feel safe wherever they go. I'm with my friends when I'm out and about, or even when I'm looking online and seeing other queer stories. It is unfortunately maybe a Black trans woman who was unfortunately unalived because of hate for society. Oh, not excuse me,
right,
not society. I'm sorry. Hate for queerness, unfortunately. It's just,
right.
and beyond that, sorry, not to go off on a tangent, but even beyond that,
Go
it's
right ahead.
simply just a lack of understanding. That's why, like you're saying, we really need to have that education. That lack of understanding mixed in with ignorance leads to chaos. It leads to confusion. It leads to just horrible outcomes. We need something set in place like education or like future individuals who have a PhD like yourself, who will have a PhD like yourself, or also like me, because I'd like to get a PhD, to focus on individuals who, are wanting to feel more comfortable in society.
But I think you also like I just to that point real quick, I think
Mhm.
the education has to be sort of at a grassroots level because you can go on a circuit, right, and speak about why this is important, but the people that need to hear it aren't there. So it's kind of like going out into the communities and really speaking to people about, why this is important. um, you know, equity, equality, all of it, and in the society, why that's important. I think the way to reach the people that really need to hear it is to be, feet on the ground doing that.
Yes. Also, I want to quickly say to everyone, guys, feel free to comment in the chat or openly in the chat. I'm actually going to open it up to Q&A now. I have some private comments here that I'll read out as well, but feel free to also, if you'd like to unmute, just raise your hand up and then we can go into it. But so the first question that I do see here, or that someone did send out to me, was, in your work across school systems and community mental health settings, what programs or interventions have you seen make the biggest impact?
Good question. I think, excuse me, the last school system that I worked for was a pretty big school district in California. I think they did a really great job with expanding mental health services. They had, of course, school counselors, but we were the people that were really in the schools providing the mental health treatment and also educating the staff. I think that was a big thing. Um, they have like a multi-tiered service. It's called MTSS in terms of how they provide intervention to their students. It's in like a three-tier system. And then, but I think there needed to be a lot of education for the teachers, the administrators, and other support staff around recognizing when somebody needs help. I mean, understanding what we were talking about earlier, social emotional growth is super important. And to be able to teach that in the classroom, well, I'm a teacher, I'm teaching curriculum. Well, you have to also teach this too, right? Because again, do you know if your student had dinner the night before? Do you know if your student has housing? So let's talk about, these types of interventions. So I feel like the most effective interventions that I've experienced is having mental health staff in there working not only with the students, but in with the staff to educate. Again, it all comes back to education, really helping them to understand and have some compassion around where a student might come from instead of saying, well, that student's acting like X, Y, and Z. It's why don't you understand their story, and let's all come together and support them. And then you will have your job will be easier too if that's what you're looking for. So,
Thank you for sharing that. Oh, we
sure.
have another question. How can peers, teachers, and families better support LGBTQ plus youth?
peers, teachers, and families. I think, the school district, if they are working towards having parent connection, that's another really good piece to it, because I think also experiencing um, in the schools where there was a lot of times some, I don't know, discussions about how do you fold the parents in? How do you disclose certain things to the parents? Should it be the staff doing that? What's the line? And I think establishing relationships with the family so that you can have discussions. The school system can serve as sort of a middleman, a middle person, um, a middle entity to foster that, because I think sometimes the students find a staff member that they trust and they might lean into. And so I think if uh, if that staff member or members can establish relationships with the parents, it's pretty important in terms of how the youth does overall.
Thank you for sharing. We have a few more questions. A
Sure.
few more questions. So, based on your experience, what are some warning signs that a young queer person might be struggling with their mental health?
Well, I mean, I think you'll see signs of, depression or anxiety, maybe some increased or start use of substances, um, maybe sleep and appetite issues, maybe grades start faltering, maybe they start skipping school, suicidal ideation, um, you know, feelings of worthlessness or self-deprecating behavior. They might be more provocative. Um, so really things that are maybe not necessarily baseline. Or if they sort of, that person did struggle a little bit with their mental health, it may be compounded by something they experienced. So those would be some of the red flags I would be looking for.
It's so interesting that you bring up those examples of what it can look like, because that is exactly what those same effects that you bring up, those same signs are the exact effects of bullying or the symptoms of, a person going through bullying. See, it's
Right.
unfortunately a lot of these things are very intertwined, but at the bare
They
minimum,
are.
you know that, this is not right. Something is going on. I should
Right.
try to help this person if I can, or look up some resources that could help them. Be a upstander. That's someone who supports someone who's going through
Yes.
bullying
Hmm.
or really just anything negative.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, you do see that. You're right. Those symptoms could be for a lot of things, but I think if you can have a dialogue with somebody, engage them, you may find out more.
Yeah, I'll wrap it up with one last question, and it's dealing with advice. Lastly, what advice would you give to aspiring mental health professionals who want to focus their careers on LGBTQ plus care and advocacy?
Okay. Well, I would, as I look back on my path, I would say that I would try to I feel like my undergrad program did support me in getting quite a bit of experience, but I think I would have um, talked to other professionals, try to be mentored, try to get a lens inside. I think we can imagine with any career what it might be like, but with this one, you really should sort of, um, try to find out as much as possible, because what we envision a job might be and what it really is are very different things a lot of times. Um, and if the person isn't in their own therapy and you have the opportunity to experience what that might feel like, you would then understand what a person um, would maybe experience trying to connect with therapy. I think it's can be challenging for anyone in general, but then for I think the LGBTQ community, it's just that much harder. And if you are in therapy already, then you can just kind of sit back and be an observer of your own experience and say, how was this experience for me, really, to get into it, to get comfortable with this person, and to start sharing. And do I really share everything? Like, how much do I really share? How much do I really trust this, therapeutic relationship? So I think those are all things to really focus on, because once you're sitting in that chair and you're the therapist, it's really important to understand the process and what a person goes to connect.
Well, Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today and really giving your knowledge and insight on the topic of LGBTQ plus mental health.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and everyone, thank you for joining. Remember, joining the Humanity Rising movement means that you can receive service hours for watching the Mindful Connections podcast and completing our after episode survey. You can do that right now if you're watching this live. And also, when this is posted on YouTube later, you can go right ahead. It'll be linked in the comments. Go right ahead, click on the link to interview, and you'll be able to receive your service hours for completing the after service, or excuse me, the after podcast episode survey. So, everyone, remember, let's be mindful and rise up for ourselves and for each other. All right, everyone, we will see you on our next show and have a good one.